Welcome back to the IndiePro Summit. I'm your host, Russell Allert, and today we are talking about behavioural science and how this revolution in marketing can change the way that you do business. And to talk about this topic today, we have Thomas Cornwall, all the way from the UK. Hi, Thomas.
Hi there, how's it going?
How are you going? We had a few audio issues, so Thomas is on his phone if it looks a bit funny. But he's going through loud and clear, so it should be all good. Thomas, do you want to just sort of tell people who haven't heard of you a little bit about what you do? Now, you run a behavioural insights boutique agency. Is that how to sort of sum it up?
Yeah, exactly. So I'd kind of sum it up as I'm an applied behavioural scientist. So I started out I was right place, right time. I started out when the first so-called nudge unit came to be in the UK government, and I worked there, but quickly saw and quickly got inspired by David Ogilvy and Howard Gosage, who we'll talk about, and lots of kind of marketing gurus, and really realized that actually ultimately everything in business is about behavior change, about turning strangers into customers and customers into fans. And so I kind of leaped off there and set up a company, as you say, called Behave. So we work with Fortune 500 companies as well as fast-growing startups to apply behavioral science to marketing, to communications, and also to how they grow.
So just give us a bit of background around this sort of behavioral science, because a lot of people might not be who probably aren't marketers, probably don't know, because this is sort of exploded over the last few years, definitely. But it's been around, and we'll talk about this because I think a mutual hero of ours, Howard Gosage, which is around back in the 50s, sort of Mad Men era, was really the first pioneer of this stuff. So it's been around for a long time, but it's really only exploded, I guess, thanks to the internet and internet marketing and all that stuff. So could you give me maybe how long you've been doing it and what exactly it involves?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So, I mean, as you say, this isn't new. So if we go back to the early days of public relations, there's a guy called Edward Bernays, who was Sigmund Freud's nephew, who made public relations. And there's always been I think it was in the 50s, there was the hype around the hidden persuaders about subliminal messaging and all this stuff. But really, it's kind of been over the past 10 years or so. So books like this book called Nudge and Thinking Fast and Slow and Predictably Irrational by Dan. So Predictably Irrational is by Dan Ariely. And essentially, it's about the kind of recent breakthroughs in our understanding of why we do what we do. So we make about 35,000 or so decisions every day. And behavioral science is about understanding, what is it that really drives and motivates those things. And then I guess the applied thing is then, okay, understanding a bit more about why I chose object A over object B, or product A over product B, or company A over company B. Then actually, how can you embed that into what it is that companies do, be that from, Apple, whose use of, various luminaries and legends in the kind of Think Different campaign, to very, very simple things like guest checkouts on online checkouts, which, massively increase the likelihood people are going to buy. It's one of those things that the way I describe it and the way a lot of people who I work with describe it is kind of like the glue that fits everything together, because everything really is about behavior change in some way. And so rather than us just guessing, which is so much, it seems to happen so much in marketing and advertising especially, why not actually have some kind of science that you base your communications off, that you base your everything from your copy to the photos to, what it is that your company offers to your proposition and so on.
Yeah, excellent. I like that. I like that expression, the glue that holds everything together. I think that's pretty accurate. Well, I've actually another speaker on this. I don't know if you know him, Brian Massey. Did talk about? Does talk about behavioral science in another video, but he sort of positions that into creating a landing page and how that science can be applied in a very practical way. So it'd be great to have a little bit more of a chat around the theory of it. One of the things that you've got on your website, which is behaviolabs.co, is that right?
Yeah, behaviolabs.co.
Yeah, I'll link to it down below. But one of the things that you've got on there is a PDF guide. And I totally recommend people reading it because it gives a really cool introduction into behavioral science and what you can actually do. And you touched on it there, and it doesn't have to be like an Apple campaign. You know, it can be something as simple as you know, adding a button on a checkout, or you know, I think one of the great things in that PDF was the Marmite example that you gave. Around, you know, Marmite did this whole campaign that cost so much, and then they could have just added a sticker saying "keep refrigerated," because your idea is that it, you know, the refrigerator is the number one place people go all the time, and they can see that brand, you know, again and again and again, and reuse that product again and more often, and you know, simple things like that.
Exactly. So it's, I think there's a big myth about one of those, you know, innovation is one of those big fancy words that people trot out all the time. And I think the perception often is, especially if you're running a small business, that it has to be expensive or all about technology or take a hell of a lot of time to develop something. But really what you learn from a better understanding of decision making and a better understanding of why, you know, behavior and so on, is that actually really small, tiny things can make a massive impact. So as you say, things like guest checkout buttons on websites, things like all sorts of stuff can just make a monumental impact to why somebody chooses X over Y. And the nice thing about it is once you understand, you know, it's a bit like the 80-20 principle. Once you understand 80% of the stuff about behavioral science, which doesn't really take that long, you'll begin to see different ways that you can improve results across your business in really practical ways.
Sorry, yeah, the PDF you talk about also talks about changing perceptions too, which I'd really like to touch on, because there's a really good example around, you give it like the difference between like diamonds and I can't remember the name of it, but another stone that's exactly the same, and
yeah,
you know, pretty much identical, and the perception is that diamonds are worth more, therefore people pay more. And same with Apple products, people pay more because they think that it's, you know, because of how they think about the company. It's not necessarily the actual product itself.
Yeah.
How that company is perceived. So is it easy to change people's perceptions around that sort of thing to get them to pay more or to choose you instead of someone else?
So on the diamond example, I mean, the great thing about that is that I'm reading a book right now. It's called The Engagements. I'll send you the link so you can link it for people watching.
I think we'll be mentioning a lot of books in this because you mentioned Nudge before, and Nudge is one of my favorite books of all time.
Yeah, it's a great book.
So I'll definitely link to all those sort of book titles.
Okay, cool. So essentially, I mean, because diamonds haven't always been a luxury good. So this book, and I'm just starting it, so ask me in a week and I tell you more about it. But the idea was there was a female copywriter in the 50s who kind of had to prove two things, which was one, that she could sit at the table with men. So it was it was almost pre-Mad Men, but it was that kind of era, and also had to demonstrate why women should wear diamond rings or should care about this thing. And so she was the one who came up with the phrase "a diamond is forever," and of course that turned this random rock into something that every single person in the world likes to stick on. You know, every single woman would love to stick on their finger. How she did that was then first positioning it through the advertising that De Beers did, and then secondly putting diamonds into movies and screenplays and putting them in the hands of celebrities and so on. So that was, you know, for a small business looking at that, that's a crazy difficult thing to change the perception massively around an object. But I mean, the nice thing about online is that actually a small business can compete with a big business in such simple ways. So if you think about 30 years ago, you'd have to build a brick and mortar store, and to build the right perception around it, you'd have to invest a lot of money into what the point of sale, what the environment looks like, decorate it, and so on and so forth. But now, like, I mean, you can change people's perceptions by having a slightly better branded website or whatever it may be. You know, the copywriting, the way that you write something can change people's perceptions. So, I mean, I guess it depends really. If you're talking about something like making diamonds popular or making whatever your a random product popular, then maybe it can be difficult. But at the same time, there are some pretty practical ways that you can influence the way that people look at things, and it doesn't have to be, as I said, big expensive things. Actually, very simple things like design can have quite a practical, tangible impact.
There's even studies to suggest that just increasing your pricing is a signal that something is worth more than it actually is.
Perfect example. So let's say you were trying to compete with Coca-Cola. So the natural thing, a very economic, rational thing would be to say, right, we're going to make it less expensive. We're going to give you more of it, and it's going to taste better. So 3 obvious ways to do it. Yet the only company that's competed with Coca-Cola is Red Bull, which is more expensive, which comes in a smaller can, and also tastes horrible. Like universally in every single focus group they've had, people have said, look, this stuff tastes crap. You couldn't pay me enough money to drink this. I hate it. And yet, one of the things that's actually in the guide is about shape versus size. So it's a slight theory, but I think it's that actually raising that price and putting it in a smaller can makes you think of it in terms of, oh, it's some kind of magic potion as opposed to some sugary drink.
Yeah, actually, when I never actually thought of the Red Bull can so much as after I read that, and as soon as I read that point that you made, it's so subtle, and yet when you're aware of it, it's so powerful.
Yeah,
like once I read that, I was just like, actually, yeah, that's actually a really powerful signal.
It's I guess without going too much into evolutionary psychology, it's it's a tall and thin can versus a shorter and fatter can, and when you put them next to each other, it's which one do people select? And I think it's I don't know whether it was intentional, whether Red Bull had some geniuses behind the whole, who were architecting the whole thing, but now I was in Bali recently, and every single can is now the tall and thin one in the same size. And actually in the UK, I don't know if it's the same in Australia, but they're now beginning to roll out the different size can.
Yeah, I actually I was going to mention that Coke has pretty much the same size can now. So
I'm sure it's as a response though. I'm sure they're
and it's goes along with the whole smaller portions thing and people's awareness of health and stuff, I think too. But yeah,
exactly.
There was another example I just finished reading Content Inc. by Joe Paluzzi, who was the founder of the Content Marketing Institute. It's a pretty good book if you want to get started on content marketing, but he's talked about actually using the word content marketing, and he sort of claims that he started using it on his site, and then because there was no real term for it up until that point, or the terms that were around were a bit used for other industries, and so he just ran with that term and just used it as though it had always existed, and he created this whole industry around him and his brand based on just coming up with a name that sounded something that marketers would actually grab hold of. So that's that's a pretty cool example of changing people's perceptions around.
So norms so often. So if you think about something like the sharing economy, which is something that if you trace the origins back, it was I think it's a New York Times columnist a famous columnist called Thomas Friedman, who I'm pretty sure was paid by Airbnb's PR team to write an article called The Sharing Economy. Because if you think about it, Airbnb's challenge is, how do you persuade people to stay in strangers' rooms, which is quite a hard problem to solve. But suddenly if you make it a norm in the same way, content marketing becomes a thing, then actually people may be more likely to do it. So all sorts of examples of when you make it a norm to do something, people will actually more likely to do it, versus if it's just some random thing that seems weird.
To be honest, if I was investing in businesses when Airbnb was around, I would never have invested in that company.
So Chris Sacca, who's a big-time Silicon Valley investor, so he's in Twitter, Instagram, you know, all those kind of things. Pretty sure he turned Airbnb down because he was like, "Who stays on strangers' couches?
Yeah,
this isn't a thing."
Yeah.
And they're laughing at him now, right?
yeah. I'm sure he's made more, you know, good bets than he has.
I'm sure he's fine. I'm not worried about him. But
he's not going to be sleeping on your couch anytime soon.
No, exactly.
Yeah. So we'll move along. I guess there's another important thing in the guide, and I've sort of been using your guide as a kind of a structure for this talk, because I think there was a lot of important points in it around, and I'd like you to explain this a little bit better, I guess, is around the context matters principle. So could you sort of show us, you know, or tell us sort of how that fits in?
Yeah, so hold on, let me just get the right page in front of me, because I know, whilst I did write it, you know what So I mean, content is an interesting one, which is that we often think about motivation as being the biggest reason why people do or don't do something. So take an example of healthy eating or dieting or something like that, where people say, "Oh, I just need my problem is I'm not motivated enough to go to the gym 5 days a week. I'm not motivated enough to eat healthily." But actually, often the case is that the context in which their context doesn't allow them to make good choices. So for instance, if your route home from work was walking past McDonald's, KFC, Burger King, and so on and so forth, you're much more likely to start eating McDonald's, Burger King, KFC on your way home than if you're passing through salad bar, smoothie place, you know, healthy restaurant. And so context massively influences what choices we make. So again, if you put lots of chocolate in your or cake or whatever in your kitchen, you're much more likely to actually eat that, whereas if you have a kitchen full of apples or whatever. So context, I think the example I give is that a supermarket tried out trying to sell different types of wine, and they found when they played German music in the supermarket, more people bought German wine, and when they played French music, more people bought French wine. So a really subtle thing, but those little cues in the environment actually pointed people towards things. And you'll see this all the time let's say if you go into a store, the point of sale, GoPro are kind of the master of this, where they have really fancy point of sale with a great video playing of someone doing snowboarding or surfing or whatever, and then all the accessories, and it's in this really glamorous case, versus the camera that has a better zoom, that does all of these other things that maybe people would care about, but that's kind of in the back of the store, so nobody really walks past it. Saying they tried things in schools, and this is one of the things you've probably seen in Nudge, where when they put the healthy food as the first choice that people see when they walk into the canteen or the cafeteria, they're much more likely to choose salad than if you put burgers and hot dogs there. So yeah, I mean, with context, it's just about how choices are presented to us can have a massive impact on what we choose. Restaurants is another example, right? So you're presented with a wine list, and of course, wine is the thing that's got the biggest markup. And so everything's kind of nudging you towards choosing that.
Yeah, there's a another that music thing really freaks me out. Like the fact that you're just playing music of a certain nationality, and then more people subconsciously hear that music and then choose the same nationality for wine. That just, you know, that's pretty full on stuff. But there's another great example that I read around a mattress store, and I know you mentioned a mattress store in the book, in the PDF as well. But there was one where they were trying to figure out how they could actually pivot people's perceptions around price versus quality. And on their website, all they did in the end was they had three. So they were split testing their website. So they had three versions. One was just the neutral background. One was a background that had money on it, like very subtle. And the other one was pictures of clouds. And they found that the people who viewed the money background, this was just the background, it had no, nothing else, always asked more questions about the price of the bed, and the ones with the clouds just asked about the comfort and never asked about the price. And so they actually sold the mattresses at a higher price without argument and without sales with the cloud background. That's phenomenal.
I think
wallpaper change on your website can increase sales.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I think companies, you can compete on price or you can compete on quality or experience, as you say. And by mentioning price in any way, shape or form, even if you're saying our price is lower, you're making people think about price. And as a result, you're, priming them, I guess is the technical word or whatever, but you're priming them to think about price versus quality. So I'd always say, something I always say to clients is let's look through and check that you're not priming people to think about the wrong things. Another one would be with food, where companies say, oh, this is the low fat version, and everyone thinks, oh great, it's low fat, so it must taste like crap. And as a result are less likely to buy it, even though you could say this new improved low fat formula, they may say we want to drink something that has, or eat something with less sugar, but actually you're making people think about the negative rather than actually focusing on great taste, or in your case, great experience, or how comfortable the bed is, or whatever it may be.
Yeah. Good example. Well, I cannot let this talk go by without talking about, and we mentioned his name already, Howard Gossage. So the reason I actually found you to ask you on this was I read his biography about him, and then I did some Googling and came across a Medium article that you wrote about him and about his his marketing beliefs. And if you don't know about Howard Gossage, he was one of the madmen, but he was one of the good ones, I guess you could probably say. And he sort of bucked the trend and created his own small agency that he kept small for the entire life of it, and really wrote some, he was a genius and he was ahead of his time in many ways. He, they talk about him kicking off the environmental movement, with a few ads, and, working with the people of the time who really changed the world. And that was his sort of goal in the end, is to use advertising. He saw advertising as a kind of a waste of just on products, but he really wanted to change the world with it. But he did some amazing things. But could you just sort of maybe talk about your thoughts on that and him, and how maybe he's influenced you, and how that whole behavioral science has kind of evolved from what he did? And because I know in one part of your guide you talk about using advertising as an involving story, and involving your the people who read it. And Howard Gossage was really good at that, in the way that he really engaged the readers of the ad by using coupons back then in newspapers to get them to take action, which is, now it seems quite you want to get people to take action, but back when they had newspapers and no internet, he was way ahead of his time in his thinking.
Yeah, he was. Howard Gossage, I'd put as number one influence. I think he's just an absolute genius. It's such a shame that he died fairly young, but I think, trying to think, so he would have been past it now. But anyway, he's just a genius. So he initially, as you say, when everyone was having their 3 martini lunches in New York City and sat on Madison Avenue, he set up an ad agency in San Francisco, which was the complete backwaters that nobody would go to. But he was, him and his agency, Weiner and Gossage, just did such incredible work that he managed to get clients like, say, like Fina Petrol, or I'm not sure if they're a big brand now, but he kind of took them from nothing to being a quite reasonable position against Shell and BP and all of those. And the way he did it was through crazy involving promotions, really. So I guess the first ad that made him famous was for Qantas, and so the Aussie airline, where your typical, what was happening is there was a competitor who'd rolled out a new jumbo jet, and the typical way of competing would be to say, okay, here's a new ad where we're saying we have, again, we have cheaper prices, we have better beds, better interior, whatever it is. Instead, Howard realized that people don't really care about that. They do care about that, but that's like a brand talking to people on their terms. Whereas the famous phrase that Howard uses is people read what interests them, and sometimes that's an ad. And so he realized that actually, why don't we just make this a bit more involving? And he created a competition to say, be the first. I think it was, the headline is something like, be the first on your block to own a kangaroo. And so what he did was a competition to win a kangaroo if you would write in to give your name for this new jumbo jet. So people from all over the country wrote in with whatever the name that they thought that this jumbo jet should be called. He then, and this was a big thing about Howard, rather than doing a whole campaign, which is again the Mad Men era, they planned 6 months advertising. In fact, they still do this. They still plan your 6 months advertising out. What Howard would do instead is realize that you need to plan do your next ad based on the response you get to the first one. So people wrote in, and eventually they chose Sam as the winner, and then he had a follow-up saying, now we have another competition for this or that or the other. And he'd do the same. It was kind of, seems almost like radio promotions that kind of got popular about, call in and we'll tell us the answer to this and we'll give you whatever it may be. But he then applied that, as you say, to other problems. So when Congress tried to pass a bill to put a dam at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, which would slightly flood, put some water into it. He, rather than saying, this is a bad thing, he then put up an ad which basically said, I can't remember the exact headline, but again, you can find it online, and we'll link to it, I guess, which is about, should we flood the Sistine Chapel so that people can get closer to the ceiling, or something like that?
Yeah, I think the original ad, the first ad was stop the Grand Canyon from being flooded, which wasn't entirely true.
That was it. It wasn't true, but
part of it. And then there was someone who said, that one of the the government officials sort of said, but people can see the closer the walls closer and see the canyon. And then his next ad was, would you flood the Sistine Chapel so you could get closer to the ceiling, which was a brilliant line.
And in that, I mean, the genius is, as you said, he then put the names and addresses of all of the Congress members there, so people would write in and send their coupons in.
Like the digital equivalent of that is how Get Up. I don't know if Get Up's big in the UK, but sign this petition. And they get 200, 300 million people to sign it, and then that goes to the right people, and then but pre-internet, he just got people to cut out a coupon, write their name, and send it to their congressman, and they used to get volumes of these coupons.
I mean, it's amazing how it's amazing. So I think there's one in the US as well called something like 5 Calls, which is a similar thing where they'll tell you the exact details to get in touch with your congressman or whatever it may be to change them. But I mean, nothing's going to change, if we're talking about behavior change, nothing's going to change the behavior of a politician or anyone more than getting hundreds and hundreds, thousands of emails, letters, phone calls, whatever it may be. And Howard, I guess, was the first to really think about advertising, not just about selling products. So I think the line is, as you touched, he realized that it wasn't, advertising could be used for other purposes. So he says something like, it's something like it's $1 billion hammer trying to knock a thumbtack into the wall. It's not that it doesn't work. It's just that it's so disproportionate to the task, right? And if his ideal campaign would be you do one ad and that gets it done, rather than you spend millions and millions on media space. Because
I think he came up with the idea too of and again, it's so common now, especially with the internet, is using news outlets. So he would write these ads with the intention of causing a stir, like flooding the Grand Canyon, and of course the news would just pick it up and then write article after article. And marketers do that now. because, you know, news agencies and bloggers and all that are just so much looking for content. But he was the first person to really build, you know, as he planned to build a whole media campaign around just a single ad or a couple of ads, and to then just let it naturally flow, and get people talking about it naturally, rather than just writing, like you said, 6 months worth of ads. He could do it in 2 ads, and the rest of the media would just you know, take it from there.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, he realized that this advertising doesn't exist in isolation. So what he'd much rather be in, as you say, he'd much rather not be on the advertising page. He'd much rather be on the front page, or he'd much rather be in the editorial, or whatever it may be, because that's much more. And this is okay. So it's much more believable. So this is the subtle thing, which is, I think Howard is often portrayed as this kind of saint to kind of use advertising for better ways. He was also ruthlessly commercial, and he realized that actually there was a profit motive to doing this, because of course it's much cheaper to do one ad, as you say, to create such hype about something that journalists at the time, or now bloggers, write about it by creating, you know, an event, or one example was he created a paper airplane competition to sell Scientific American to. Scientific American were trying to get more airlines to advertise there, and so he created this paper airplane competition, and that of course got picked up by the news, and it ended up getting, and this is back in the 60s, 11,000 people writing in off the back of one ad. And so if you think about what could happen today, right, if you get that right, because everything's networked in such a crazy way, you could get millions of people to respond to it. I think, honestly, I'd say, whilst a lot of people do it, I don't think a lot of people do it very well or often enough, because it's and if you get the ad platform technique right, then, you know, it does fundamentally change the course of any business. And I think more people should study what Howard did, because today it's more relevant than anything.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention the paper plane, because I think it's actually my favorite, because it ended up because it was actually a paper plane design competition. So they actually made it like, you know, make the best paper plane that you can. And then the winner, the best ones were actually, there was a whole book made of all these paper plane designs, you know, which, you know, today you can kind of see that happening a little bit more, but it's so much easier to do now than it was back in the 60s. But
it always amazes. Yeah, I mean, it always amazes me with bigger brands who have a good sized budget, why their advertising is just talking about themselves, and why it's not thinking in some of these terms. So you do see it sometimes. I think there is still a international paper plane contest, which still goes on, partly as a result of that. And you could have written one ad which said, hey, airline companies, why not advertise in our Scientific American, because lots of people who travel read our journal or whatever. Or you could have done what Howard did, which was just so much more interesting, and so much more effective.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about Howard all night
for years,
all day. But we won't. We'll move on, because we are sort of getting towards the limit of the time. But I do want to touch on a couple more points. Emotion beats logic. So that was one of the headings in your guide, and I guess it comes down to the old, economic, rational person who makes decisions based on logic and reason, where people just don't like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, the one I'd point to at the moment, so without getting too political about it, but if you look at who the US president is, do you think, was he selected because of emotion or reason? I think there's so much in not just politics, but also in business around the power of personality and the power of an individual. So, I mean, you could say Steve Jobs is exactly the same thing, right? So Steve Jobs, the power of personality, and the effect that had on Apple, he's kind of seen as the ultimate, when you mention the word innovation or creativity or whatever, he's probably one of the people that will come up straight away. And the impact of that is that Apple's the biggest company in the world still. Also, they had great products, right? But so did, as we touched on earlier, so did tech-wise, PC and so on, probably had better tech specs. So in a rational sense, you'd be much better off spending less money and getting a better quality product. But what Apple have done, and they realized that actually it's much more about emotion. It's much more about storytelling. It's much more about other things. And you could argue that, you know, Mr. Trump's doing the same thing. Now, whether he's aware of it, I don't know.
Yeah. I think the term is cult of personality. I think.
Yeah, exactly.
But you could have easily gone Brexit, but you chose Trump.
No. So but Brexit's exactly the same, right?
Yeah,
The two campaigns were it was vote leave, take back control. So take back control as a slogan is incredibly powerful, right? Because it's playing into all sorts of emotions.
Yeah.
Whereas the Remain campaign was talking it was very rational. It was like, you know, 20 business leaders have written in saying it's a good thing to do la la la.
Yeah.
And so it was, it's just, I mean, emotion beats reason every single day of the week.
Yeah. So the other thing you touched on too is personality beats price. And I think we've touched on Steve Jobs and Apple a couple of times now. And I think with the explosion of the personal brand, given the way that people can quite easily do that online, and the talk around, I think it was Simon Sinek. I don't know if he really thought of this initially, but I think he's credited with the quote around, people buy based on. Sorry, I've just totally forgotten the quote. People buy for the reasons why rather than the actual, what they're actually buying. So people want a story and want to join something as well as just buying something. There's a reason behind the why they're buying it.
Yeah, so definitely, I think it's so again, we kind of evolved in tribes. You want to be part of whatever tribe it may be. I think with personal brands in particular, I think people buy from people, and that's true throughout the ages. So I mean, one person, a guy I particularly admire more in the internet marketing space, I think is Frank Kern. So I think he's a genius at telling, years ago when he'd portray this kind of surfer beach bum, which is the exact archetype of what it is that somebody who aspires to build an internet business wants their lifestyle to look like. Same with, you could argue the same with Tim Ferriss. The biographies that he told when the 4-Hour Workweek came out were, I travel around the world, I'm this digital nomad, and so on and so forth. And it's just the perfect story which resonates perfectly with the audience versus if you stuck a kind of impersonal brand on it. And so I think, I think personal branding is incredibly powerful. And again, I do wonder why more businesses don't do it. It may be because it's not for everybody, right? So I guess it can backfire if you don't have the right, it works particularly well if you happen to be a charismatic CEO or a charismatic leader. But at the same time, allowing customers to actually meet the people behind the scenes and talking about why you do it and so on. Interesting though, on digitalmarketing.com, so on Ryan Dice's company, they have an entire video just talks about why they do what they do. So similar to your point about Simon Sinek, they're talking about their beliefs, their values and so on, which may seem a little bit talking about themselves and so on, but at the same time people do care about this thing. It's this often whenever anyone explains a story to you, why did someone do something, the question will always be about why. And once you've understand the why, then you'll kind of get into the what is it and so on. So I think Simon Sinek's he's got a very good point, and you see it kind of playing out in lots of different ways.
Yeah, and I think the why is important because you can't join a tribe until you understand why they're doing something, and as opposed to just the what. I think that's why when I look at Twitter and the struggles that they're having, Twitter seems to work so well on a personal basis, like personal brands, and yet it tanks with when businesses are on there. And it's for whatever reason, it's become a networking, you know, one-on-one talking, you know, I connected to you through that. And, you know, some of the other speakers I've connected to through Twitter as well. And I would never have had that opportunity if they were just the brand, you know, even though they've got companies, you know, if you were just on Twitter as your company, it just wouldn't work. And I think you do need that kind of, that human touch.
Yeah. I mean, I think in my head, Twitter's, and other people have said this, so I'm not the first to say this, but it's a bit like a cocktail party. And so blasting out this is why I think why it's misunderstood is because people think of it as every other medium is basically blast out your message, call to action. And it doesn't work like that, because it's much more like a conversation. So I've won business through getting in touch with people in Twitter. The only way I've done it is by seeing they've said something interesting, responded to it, they've responded to something, and then I say, well, why don't I drop you an email, or why don't you drop me, or whatever it may be. And as you say, I would never do that with a big brand. And I just find it's difficult to, I guess you could argue then, what do you do as a brand? Do you then also have a lot of your people, as a lot of companies do you have a lot of your people talking on Twitter to try and personalize, humanize everything? And then you just have the main piece to kind of tell your story and case studies or whatever you want to do. So
I think I know that there's, because I work with a lot of financial institutions, mutuals, credit unions, and building societies, and I know that there's one in Vancouver, Van City, who actually get some of their employees to just be on Twitter just for the company as a personal touch. So whenever there's an event on or something, they'll tweet about it, and it'll sort of help drum up that initial, these people are talking about it. But they're brand ambassadors basically, but they're still themselves. So there's a really good way of actually bridging that problem. And I think I remember reading talking about big companies, Google or Alphabet as they're known now. I think Matt Cutts and a few others actually had a real problem with Google letting them talk. And Matt Cutts is the face of Google for a lot of people, because his videos are so good and just so natural, and he's so charismatic and a lovable guy. And that really humanized the brand. But I think in the beginning they had real trouble with getting those videos out.
Definitely. Interesting one about Google is so Ev Williams, who's one of the founders of Twitter. Before that, he founded Blogger. It's a big blogging platform, I guess, back in Web 1.0 days, and that was then acquired by Google. And so at the time, it was something like the 5th highest trafficked company in the website in the world. But when he went to Google, they kind of put him in a corner and didn't really give them any funding and didn't take it seriously. And similarly, Eric Schmidt, who's, I don't know if he's still chairman, but he was chairman or CEO of Google, kind of said Twitter's like a poor man's email, which kind of fundamentally misunderstands that it's not the same thing as email. Well, I'm not a Twitter evangelist particularly, but I think their huge challenge is there's an immense amount of business value created on that platform, mainly through what we were discussing. So you got in touch with me by just sending me hey, I'm doing this thing, do you fancy getting involved? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. But how do you monetize that? How do you, because the advertising, I've tried Twitter advertising out, and personally I found it just hasn't really worked. I haven't got the ROI that I can get elsewhere.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I do, and it just doesn't work for anyone.
Exactly. And I mean, but at the same time, it's I've made a company's made more money off my time on Twitter than it has on Facebook, but I've given much more money to Facebook than I have to Twitter. So it may be that, and there may be no way to solve it. Aside from, I guess you could start charging fees for using it and all this kind of stuff, a bit like LinkedIn does. But I don't know. They're a bit stuck, and I
don't think we're going to solve Twitter's problem.
No,
today. Not the next couple of minutes. The one thing I do, the last thing we will wrap it up soon, but the one thing I do want to touch on, because I think it's really important, and it's such a an easy thing to do to, help customers or get more business, is to make it easy. And that's, again, one of the things you touched on in that, just make it easier for people. One of the example you used was a mattress seller who over-ordered accidentally and then had to sell them, and then basically just came up with the idea of, oh, we'll take your old mattresses. And people just rushed in and went, yeah, okay, take my old mattress and give me a new one. Like just making it, I guess it comes into solving people's problems, as well, with that example, but just making things easier, even on the website. Like there's so many websites. Like when I do advertising for companies, if their end website isn't usable or it's not easy for people to buy, like there's no point running those ads.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I had a client a couple of years ago and it was for a fitness, it was quite a big company, but fitness membership. And the problem was they were saying, right, how can we improve whatever the opt-in page is? So I guess this is like tactics v strategy. So tactics, you can improve the copy, you can improve whatever it is. But as you say, if at the end of it, I think what it was is they signed you up to some kind of automatic subscription service, and you had to fill in your payment details, even though they weren't charging you for an amount of time, and all this kind of stuff, where everyone basically, we got many more people to get through to that final page, but everyone then dropped off at that final page because the offer just wasn't compelling enough. It was so difficult to buy from them as a company. And I think especially you do see it in B2C companies. So anything you can do to make it easier for someone to make that first purchase, do it. B2B is just sometimes just an absolute nightmare to I'm amazed with some companies that anyone bothers to go through, because it's such an ordeal to actually speak to somebody about what it is they're selling and all of these kind of things. That, as you say, just make it easier for someone to get in touch, and then you can build that relationship, even if it's not a sale right away, even if it's just a point of contact. 100%.
Yeah, I think the term some people use is reduce the friction.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Which is where
No, go on. Were you going to say something?
I was just, so the example, I guess the famous one's called the $300 million button, where, and I think it was Amazon, they realized everyone was getting to the last page, but actually people didn't want to enter into the relationship of filling in all their details. They just wanted to buy something. So stick a guest checkout out there and you can do it. I spent about a year just implementing that with a few companies, and every single time it worked, because it's just it comes back to what we're talking about. It just comes back to a fundamental thing about human nature, right? We want things that we'll choose the easier thing. If there's the stairs or the escalator or whatever you call it in Australia, everyone will choose the escalator over the stairs.
Yeah, definitely. I think on that point, we'll leave it. I think we've been talking long enough.
Brilliant.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for joining me on this chat. It's been a blast for me, and I hope it's been a blast for the viewers as well. Maybe we talked about Gossage too much, but definitely worth checking out. Even to read a biography of him, because he was and just to learn how he did things, because he great inspiration for any marketers or even business owners out there. Thank you so much for joining me. All the links below, a lot of the books we spoke about, and I'll link to your website so people can download that guide too, just to read about what we've been talking about. Thank you so much for viewing, for people at home or on their mobile or wherever they are. Many more videos coming up. Thank you for joining me for another one, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much, Thomas.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, hope everyone enjoyed it.